Chapter 1 of A Queen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Esther and Simonides. A Queen by Ottilie WILDERMUTH. Translated by Unknown. Chapter 1. Unconscious Rule. Upon a broad, smooth meadow stood the dwelling of a small farmer, whose chief support was drawn from the forest, from which, indeed, his farm had been taken, and whose house was the largest and best for some distance round. It was Saturday afternoon, the eve of the Lord's Day, and within doors, for in that remote province everybody still adhered to the good old habits of their pious ancestors, everything had been neatly arranged, and was left in quiet order, that all might be ready to give the proper devotional welcome to the coming day. The green in front of the house, however, presented a scene quite animated enough to show that there was active life somewhere, though there was none of the bustle usually attendant upon week-day occupations, when one labour presses so closely upon another as to leave between them little time for rest. Old grandmother had put aside her wheel, and now sat in the sunniest spot she could find, with baby Gertrude on her lap. The farmer himself, a healthy, pleasant-looking man, sat on a wooden bench, peeling willow rods. The hired man was bestirring himself to finish up some odd jobs. The serving boy was cleaning up the litter that had accumulated in different spots. The tailor, who had been there all the week, making and mending, and had been invited to stay over Sunday, sat idly enjoying the calmness and repose of the hour. The maid, and the house mother, as the mistress of the family is so beautifully called in Germany, were peeling potatoes for the family supper, and the children were playing in the grass. Lisa, the eldest little daughter, was admiring the pretty new apron that the seamstress had just brought home to be in readiness for the morrow, and upon a low branch of the linden tree sat Margelt, or, as we should say in English, Maggie, the orphan of a poor woman who had supported herself by spinning, and whose destitute child the kind-hearted farmer and his wife had, for the dear God's sake, taken into their own family. "Tomorrow night they are all to start for America," said the tailor, suddenly breaking the silence. "There will be a great wagonful of them, and Christopher, the son of mine host of the Eagle, is to be one." "Well," said the farmer, "I thank God that I have no need to go abroad for a living. I get on very well at home." "Yes, I believe that," said one of the maids timidly. "You say what is very true, cousin," for among the peasantry of the fatherland, cousin, uncle, etc., are the names by which the employed commonly address their employers. "But I think I should like to be going with them, for what could a poor thing like me do better? And who knows, either, what might come to one out there?" "I would rather get a place in the town," said the other girl, half aloud. "That is not so far off. There are always places enough to be had, and in the town, oh, they do wear such beautiful clothes!" "And I would like to be a soldier!" exclaimed little Michael, who had heard just enough to understand that they were naming their favourite occupations. "But I want to be a real soldier, and have a horse and a golden trumpet." "I'd rather be a butcher!" cried Jacob. "Butchers have to travel so far. They go about and see such fine places, and such beautiful cattle. What do you want to be, George?" "A farmer," replied George, the eldest in the house, with an air of great importance. "There is no trade better than that, nor pleasanter either." "I don't think so," simpered Lisa, with many airs and graces. "The town folks are a great deal more genteel. I'd like to be a town lady, or a schoolmistress. Then one can have as much money as one wants, and need not be plagued." "Really, you are very knowing," said the mother, rather sharply. "Town folks more genteel, indeed! In my opinion, it's the meanest sort of life you can lead, to be obliged to buy every pound of flour you can use, and every time you are about to put a morsel into your mouth to have to ask, 'How much does it cost?'" "Well, now, and what do you want to be?" said the quick-witted tailor, turning to Maggie, with whom he often passed a merry jest. "What now? A ballet dancer, perhaps?" "A queen," was the quiet answer. A shout of laughter burst from every mouth. "Maggie, the little charity girl, a queen?" "Well, you're not so foolish after all," said the tailor. "But how will you go to work to make yourself one?" "Oh, I shan't take much trouble about it," said Maggie from her perch. "I dreamed once that I was one, and had a golden crown on my head, and I liked it very much, so I would like to have it come to pass. But things of that kind, you know, tailor, must come of themselves; you can't cut them out and patch them together, as you do tailoring work." The laugh was now turned against the tailor, who seemed for the time no longer inclined to jest with the little damsel. "Come down here in the meantime, Madam Queen, and empty those potato parings in the pig pen," called the mother. Maggie hopped down like a bird, and laughed heartily with the rest at the unqueenly nature of the job. It was nearly dark too, so everybody was obliged to go into the house. From that day forth Maggie went altogether by the name of Madam Queen, and was many a time bantered and laughed at about her wish. She did not let that trouble her, however, but went merrily on her way, for it was not possible to hurt her feelings seriously, for a more kind, merry-hearted creature the world did not contain. She sang from morning till night, and after she had been driven from one piece of work to another through the whole day, she was as lively and active in the evening as a young bird. And there was something very queenly in her too. She was so gentle, so kind to all about her. Poor as she was, those who felt inclined to look down upon her found themselves foiled. The farmer's wild children had, at first, looked upon her as nothing better than a little dog, upon whom they could indulge all their whims. Sometimes they made her go on all fours like a dog, and sometimes they wanted to get on her back and ride as if she were a horse. Then she must put into her pocket the stones of all the plums that they had stolen and eaten, so that if the theft were discovered, she would have to take the punishment. And the mother knew all this, but she never took any measures to prevent it. She felt kindly toward the little thing, and would not for the world have seen her suffer what she considered ill treatment. But these were only little annoyances, little things, and she contented her conscience with the thought that it would do no harm for a child, situated as she was, to learn betimes not to mind trifles. Lisa, particularly, looked upon her with great superiority, and put on airs of vast dignity towards the poor little orphan in her ragged clothes. So the child had no one to whom to open her heart, except the orphan's God, to whom her mother had taught her, from her very infancy, to go as to a father and a loving friend. And such he had indeed shown himself, for he had bestowed upon her that blessed gift of a mind always contented and happy, throwing off trouble as a young bird shakes from its wings the drops of the summer rain. Many a child, blessed with kind parents, and everything else that could make them life and them comfortable and happy, does more grumbling, shows more discontent in one day than Maggie did in a whole year. Then, too, she had a pair of clear, honest eyes, and skilful fingers upon those little hands of hers, for she never lost an opportunity of learning something new, and knew how to make herself dear and useful to everybody. If Michael insisted upon having her help in playing some of his wild, rough games, she would say quickly, "Oh, that isn't nice! Just listen, Michael, I know such a pretty story." And before you could think, there sat not only Michael, but all the rest of the young ones, still as mice, close up round her, listening to what she was telling them, for she did indeed know very beautiful stories that her mother had taught her, one of a beautiful lady named Genevieve, and the children in the wood, and others still prettier. Lisa, with all her airs of dignity, was a very careless, slovenly little girl, always looking for things she had lost, which she would not, for a great deal, have her mother to know that she could not find, and lucky was it for her that Maggie had taught to be both neat and careful. It would be, "Oh, what in the world has become of my spindle? Where in the world is my thimble? I had it yesterday, and now I can't find it anywhere." "You left it yesterday," Maggie would whisper, "lying on the floor, and I put it in your drawer." Then there was another trouble for the poor orphan to bear. Lisa was a most miserable hand at spinning. She had learned from the sempsters how to crochet, and found it much more agreeable work, but her industrious, unpretending mother thought this rather an unprofitable way of spending time, and would not indulge her in it. The spinning wheel, however, showed very plainly how little interest she took in it, and was a sad-looking affair. The thread was all falling from the spindle, the hanks of beautiful yellow flax were tumbled about like bunches of old tow, and the poor mother grieved and scolded about it. Now Maggie had been taught by her mother to do all kinds of fine spinning at a much earlier age than little girls are generally put to such work, but the mother professed not to be able to trust her with anything but the very coarsest materials, and kept her upon them. The little thing felt grieved to see all the fine flax wasted, and she pitied Lisa too for having to do what she so much disliked, so sometimes she would go to her and say, "Come, let's see if I can't help you," and, taking care though to say it when the mother was out of the room, in a few moments the broken thread was spun together again, the flax was all smooth and in order, and the yarn twisted firmly and evenly upon the spindle. The little serving maid would declare that Maggie was a witch. The mother would praise Lisa's work, and boast, "How beautifully she had spun flax! though she could never trust Maggie with anything better than coarse wool or tow. And Lisa was not generous enough to tell the truth, but would take all the praise and hear poor Maggie depreciated. Her heart, though, was softened towards her, and she gradually left off her airs and unkind treatment. Thus, with her merry temper and obliging kindness, the little orphan managed to make friends of everybody. Everybody seemed glad to do her a good turn, and none remarked, herself least of all, how completely she ruled the whole house, an unconscious queen. With that rosy little mouth of hers, she dared to say many a thing that would have come very ill from anybody else. Maggie, with her clear eyes, saw too many a thing that people did not wish seen, but she did not run straight to the mistress to tell of it. She seemed always to find a way of reproving and making them feel sorry for what they had done that was wrong. And she never did so intentionally either. She never seemed to think of what she was going to do or say, but a holy horror of wrong, implanted in her heart by that dear friend of hers in heaven, God himself, and carefully cultivated and strengthened by her mother, appeared to furnish her always with the right word at the right time. At last the farmer's wife, in an extraordinary fit of kindness, determined that little Maggie should go to school, though she did have some misgivings that it was rather extravagant to give advantages to the poor charity girl. But the pastor and the schoolmaster were both heartily rejoiced at the idea, and though, for the poor child's own sake, they dared not say too much of it, they managed so to convince the good woman of the great profit it would be to her, and benefit to her own children, that Maggie was finally permitted to go whenever there was nothing to do at home, which, as may be readily imagined, was not often. Seldom as it was, though, so well did the delighted child employ her mind, her hands, and her time, so industriously did she work with the books and copy books and ink and pens, that the more wealthy children gladly lent her, that it was not long before she was able to assist even Miss Lisa herself with her exercises and lessons. The master often gave them questions in arithmetic to work out at home, and in the late afternoons, when the work was all done and the house cleaned up, Maggie would climb to her perch in the linden tree, and labour over her slates until the question was answered. Then, with a shout of "I've got it! I've got it!" she would leap to the ground and dance over the grass in delight. But, to tell the truth, it was not much sympathy that she got for her success in such matters. George sometimes would let her explain to him the difficulties of the sum, and show him how she got the answer, and how she proved it, but study was a thing about which not even George gave himself much concern, and as to the rest, they never thought of it. Hannah, the younger of the two servant maids, and the one who had been so desirous of going to America, was in the habit of going to the town with the butter and eggs that were to be sold, and, when the quantity was large, Maggie was sent to help her carry them. For a long time the mother, whose butter was much sought after, had been greatly dissatisfied that the amount she received for it had been so small, but still her confidence in Hannah was not in the least shaken, for she thought she had proved her to be a true-hearted, honest maiden. So when Hannah said, "Indeed, ma'am, nobody pays me as much for the things as they used to give," the mistress felt sure that it was so. Maggie, however, soon observed that Hannah did not give the mistress all of even what she did get, and she carried a little purse of her own. This secret weighed heavily on her heart. One day, as they were returning from the town, Hannah was joined by a friend of hers who lived near, but was to sail the very next day for America, and they began to talk about the pleasures and advantages of the New World. "I shall never be able to go," said Hannah with a sigh. "It takes so long to get together money enough to pay the passage. In the city you can get it faster." "Yes," replied the town servant, "wages are higher in the city, but then in the country there are so many things to be sold that you can easily make a little profit one way or another." Hannah would not agree to this, and soon after they parted. The town girl went into the house of her employer, and Hannah took the road back to the farm. "I should be very much afraid," said Maggie, "to go to America, to cross that great big water." "Why, yes," said Hannah, "it must be a little frightful, but then, when you're once over it, you'll never think of it again." "But there's many a ship lost in going over," persisted the little girl, shaking her head incredulously. "Many a one goes to the bottom." "And many a one goes safely too, and many a one comes back safely to tell of it," said Hannah coolly. "I wonder," continued the child, "whether it's true what they say." "Whether what's true? What do they say?" asked Hannah. "Why, that every vessel goes to the bottom that has dishonest money on board," answered Maggie. "What do you call dishonest money?" asked Hannah, with some little alarm in her manner. "Money got by cheating, or robbing, or any other way that isn't honest," answered Maggie. "You know, sometimes people's fathers and mothers die while the children are too little to take care of their property. So they leave word for someone else to do it, and then it often happens that, instead of doing it honestly and spending it for the children, they keep it all themselves, and leave the children poor. Well, such money, or what they get by any kind of cheating, they say will sink a ship when she gets just halfway across. There will be a storm, and down she'll go." "I don't believe a word of it," exclaimed Hannah, though at the same time she seemed very nervous. "It is impossible that there should be any ship going across without some such money on board, carrying such crowds as they do." "I don't know," persisted Maggie. "I asked the schoolmaster about it once, and he said that he did not know whether that was exactly true, but he knew another thing just as bad that way, and what I asked him about was a kind of pattern in it. That was that, in our voyage over the sea of life, into the regions of eternity, every penny dishonestly come by would keep weighing upon the soul heavier and heavier, dragging it down deeper and deeper away from God." Hannah did not say another word. She went home, and when she paid into the hands of the mistress the money she had got for the butter, eggs, and cream that she had sold, the good woman was utterly astonished at the largeness of the sum, and wondered what could have happened to raise the market prices so suddenly. Maggie slept upon a little straw pallet in the room with the housemaids, and that night she saw and heard Hannah tossing and tumbling on her bed in the most uncomfortable manner. At last the girl got up, went to her chest, and began to count over some money, but as Maggie kept very still, Hannah thought she was asleep and did not see her. The next morning, while Hannah was hanging out the wet clothes that had just been washed, Maggie went to her and said, "Will you hear if I know my verses? It's almost school time." Hannah was very willing to oblige her, and Maggie handed her the book and began to repeat, "What shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul?" "Well, that's very well," said Hannah. "Now the next. Let none among you suffer as a murderer or a thief, or a busybody in other men's matters. But if he suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed." Hannah this time did not lift her eyes from the book, but Maggie went on, "Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the thing that is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth." "And now comes the last," said Maggie, for Hannah had not yet looked up or spoken. "Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. Behold, I will make thee a ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord." "The little thing said that on purpose," thought Hannah to herself, as Maggie took the book, and thanking her for her help, danced off. But the next Sunday Hannah went to the church, a thing she had not done for a long time. A few days after this the mother called her husband in great astonishment. "Stephen, come here quick! What do you think? Just as I was now cleaning out my milk tin bin, I found in it this roll of money, 15 pieces, good coin from the mint. I've been thinking over and over again if I could have put it there myself, and I'm almost sure I never did." "Oh, perhaps the fairies did," replied Stephen with a laugh. "Or maybe my old good godmother, who has been dead so many years, has repented of having hidden away her money as she did, and brought you some of it for good luck. I suppose you can use it at any rate." "Yes, indeed," said the wife delightedly. "It is a most useful piece of good luck, and it comes so unexpectedly," an assertion to which Stephen had nothing to object. From that day Hannah seemed like another creature. She grew brighter and more lively, and was as merry as a lark, and as obliging to everybody as Maggie herself. One day she said, laughingly, to the little one, "Maggie, when I go to America, the ship will float lightly enough, for not a dishonest penny will there be in my pocket." Now the little queen might well have felt proud enough that she had made a grown-up woman ashamed of her having done wrong, and led her to make amends for her fault. Most children would have felt so, but Maggie did not. When she had first found out that Hannah was taking and hoarding up money that did not belong to her, she prayed to God, to whom she went with all her troubles, softly in her heart, to teach her the right way to put a stop to it, without betraying the poor girl to her mistress. So God, as He has said He always will, answered her prayers, and the words she, a simple child, had uttered, had touched a conscience that had remained untouched by the daily house worship of her master's family, and the many earnest appeals and prayers of the faithful church pastor. For this the grateful orphan thanked her heavenly Father with a full heart, but she never said a word about it to any living creature. The farmer was exceedingly nervous in his fears of fire, and had very strict in not allowing the least spark to be taken into stable or barns. Melker, the farm boy, however, troubled himself very little about that, and lighted his pipe in stable or shed, by night or by day, whenever he found himself alone. The heavy step of the farmer or his wife he could hear far enough off to give him time to stick it away in some hiding place or another, until they were out of sight again. The light-footed Maggie, though, who was sent everywhere at all times, had seen this for a long while, but she knew she should get her ears boxed if she undertook to remonstrate with the lad, and worse if she told of him. So once more she went to her dear and unfailing friend, the great God in heaven, and asked for guidance and discretion in this matter also. It was winter, and all the servants were in the habit of sitting all the evening in the warm spinning room, where, one night, they were talking about a poor man who had that day been taken to the village madhouse. Each one in turn had some story of the same kind to relate, and at last it came to Maggie's turn. To her they always listened with great attention, for her stories were generally interesting and well told. "My mother," said the little girl, "once knew a person. Indeed, it was a person with whom she once lived at service in her youth, who was in just such a state as poor Carl Brenner was to-day, but they always let him go about just where he chose, and he never did anyone any harm. He was always as pale as death, and did nothing the whole day long but carry about pails of water. It seemed as if he could not bear to stop doing that one thing, and the maids all through that neighbourhood got him to bring water for them. When night came they had to lock him in the house, but before he went to bed he would blow out every light and put out every spark of fire he could get at. He never talked to anyone, and hardly ever answered a question, but once a year he would rush about the whole day in the wildest way, and cry 'Fire! Fire!' with a sad kind of a howl that went to your very heart." "How did he come to be so?" asked someone, with a shudder, in which all the rest joined. "He was the son of a rich farmer," replied Maggie, "and in spite of all his father said, never could be made to take the least care about lights and fires. He would go all about with a lighted pipe in his mouth, and carry a burning candle into the barns and stables, with as little hesitation as into the kitchen. How it happened no one ever knew, but one night he must have dropped a spark without seeing it. It smouldered and smouldered for a long time, and about the middle of the night out it burst. As it had been a very dry season, and there was little water to be had, by the time the people got there the fire had spread so wide that it was too late to do anything, and the house and the barn were burned to the ground, and all the poor animals that were in them were burned to death. Well, in the confusion none of the family were missed. Everybody supposed they were somewhere else, but when the day came nothing was to be seen of his mother and the baby. This son, almost crazy with fear, looked everywhere himself, and at last they were found under some burnt beams that had fallen upon them. The mother had the dear little baby hugged up tight in her arms, but they were both so black and burned that hardly anyone would have known them. The son buried them with his own hands, so that no one should see him. But from that hour he was as crazy as I told you, and all the doctors they could get together couldn't help him." When Maggie stopped there was a dead silence. Melker's pipe had gone out, but he did not seem to notice it, and when he went to the stable to look round before going to bed, instead of sticking it, as usual, into his pocket, he left it lying on the stove. The next evening, before he went out to the barns, he said to Caspar, "Here, you take my pipe and keep it till I come back. I'm afraid of dropping the fire." And for 2 whole weeks he never once attempted to smoke as long as he was in any of the outbuildings. Thus Maggie, by the guidance of her heavenly counsellor, though only a little charity child, reigned as a queen over all about her, and with the brute creation she did still more. With them she was queen in right earnest. When Lisa went into the barnyard to feed the poultry, at her call they would come fluttering and running from all quarters. But in the midst of the meal, if Maggie's voice was but heard, "Come, luck, 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 luck," in an instant they left all and came flying towards her, hens, ducks, pigeons, all and everything, and perched upon her head and shoulders, and would have eaten from her hand if she could but have waited for them. The farmer had a small flock of sheep that he had given in charge to a very competent farm hand, but he had very poor luck. All kinds of diseases had broken out among them, and carried off one after another, until only 4 remained. So Stephen concluded that keeping sheep, however profitable his neighbours seemed to make it, was rather poor business for him, and determined to give it up. But Maggie had heard a great deal upon this subject, and by no means agreed with him. She declared that it was much cheaper to raise one's own mutton and wool than to buy them, and so she begged to be allowed to try her hand at it. Behind the ditch where the willows grew was a bit of grass that seemed to be of no great value. This she thought would be a good place to pasture them. The farmer laughed heartily at her proposal. "Yes," said he, "you will look after the sheep, but who after you?" "Oh, I, cousin, shall not need any looking after. Just those few sheep, and so near the house! When I have to take them farther away, then somebody can look after me." She was so in earnest that the farmer consented, and the first sunny day off went Maggie with her sheep, and a shepherd's crook a good deal longer than herself. She paid no heed to the jokes and jeers of the servants, but decked herself out to the best of her means, and then took her seat upon a little hillock in the centre of the piece of grass. From this spot she could see every part of the field, and watch at her ease her new pets, who soon learned to follow her wherever she went. After a short time the flock was increased by the birth of a lamb, and then how she rejoiced! She tended it as if it had been a little baby, and very triumphantly did she look about her, when she let out a flock of 5 instead of 4. She nursed and petted the little thing all day, and when she went home at night, with her black hair encircled by the crown of flowers that she had made, she carried it in her arms that nothing might happen to it, and that it should not tire itself by trying to keep up with its mother. The mother sheep, however, did not seem to think this precaution necessary, or perhaps she was afraid that little Maggie was going to take away her little one, for she trotted along as close to her as she could walk, and kept looking up in her face in the most pitiful manner, and bleating and baaing, and the little lamb stuck out its head and looked down at her, and seemed to have a very great inclination to jump down and trot along too. But Maggie laughed at them both. "For shame, old sheep," she said, "with your baaing! You ought to be glad that I carry your baby for you, for you cannot do it for yourself, you are so old and so stupid. Don't you see that I am not doing either of you the least harm? And you, little lamb, do you keep still until I get you home, and then I will put you on the ground, and you may do as much jumping and running as you like." I don't know whether or not sheep can understand what is said to them, but, little by little, Maggie's sheep became reconciled to her ways, and let her do as she chose without making any objections. To the school Maggie had seldom, indeed, been able to go since she had been a shepherdess, but she never failed to learn carefully the lessons that were given to the class, and on this account she liked the lonely days in the sheep pasture much better than she did those during which she was employed in the house. Anyone who was listening at a little distance would have thought that there was a church somewhere in the neighbourhood, for the first thing she did when she got to the field, and she went there very early, was to sit down upon her hillock and sing a pretty morning hymn. Then, in a loud, clear voice, she repeated all the verses she knew by heart, and it sounded just like preaching. And all this time the child's heart was as peaceful and holy as many a church, for the great God had taken up his abode in it. So calm, so contented was this little destitute orphan, so satisfied for all that her heavenly Father had given her, that often and often she could not think what in this wide world she wanted more than she had. It is very doubtful if ever a queen upon her throne was as perfectly happy as this little charity child in her lonely pasture field. The old grandmother had not been at first very kind to Maggie. To be sure, the old lady had very much liked Christine, the spinning woman, Maggie's mother, and had found her always very useful and obliging, but that was no reason why, now that she was dead and buried, they should be burdened with her child. To her, a rich farmer's wife, and descended from a long line of ancestors, every one of whom had been rich farmers, there was an unspeakable difference between the poor orphan and the children of her son. She thought that the girl ought to have been sent to the workhouse, where she would have been properly broken in, as Granny expressed it, and made fit to be taken, one of these days, by some one as a servant, which was, of course, her proper place. The gentle but lively temperament of the little creature had, all along, sorely annoyed her. When she heard the little voice carolling the light gay song, the old woman's heart was ready to burst with spite and vexation that a miserable beggar child like that, who owned no more in all the wide world than could be stowed away in a small trunk, should dare be so merry and light-hearted. "Yes," she would say with a sneer, "sing away, it's all you can do." And still more outrageous was she when she heard Maggie every morning telling her dreams. Such a piece of impertinence as it was for the little hussy to dream at all, much less to talk about it afterwards. But after a while this was changed. She soon saw, hard as she tried to shut her eyes to the fact, how industrious the little girl was, and how watchful of everything connected with the interests of the house or the family, and felt obliged, whether she wanted to or not, to treat her with more kindness. Granny, although very near the grave, for she was a very old woman, was not really a Christian. She had not, like the orphan Maggie, set God always before her eyes, to acknowledge him in all her ways. Her greatest trust and most constant thought was her money, and those who had none she looked upon as unworthy her notice, and treated as if they had no feelings. There was one little Bible verse that was always uppermost in Maggie's mind, but never entered Granny's. It was this: "In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he will direct thy paths." And that one verse made all the difference between the two, made the one constantly win friends, and the other as constantly lose them. Granny was fast becoming old and infirm. She could no longer work, but loved to sit upon the bench before the house door in the sunshine, and feel her blood move more quickly in the pleasant warmth. The daughter-in-law, who had taken the place of housekeeper, of course, since Granny had been forced to give it up, didn't like to show how much it vexed her to see the old lady always sitting there, and thus keeping possession of the most pleasant spot. For the old mother had a snug little property of her own, which she was free to leave to whom she pleased, and therefore must be treated with great respect. But the poor old lady was very helpless now. She could no longer dress or undress herself, or go alone up the steps that led to her little bedroom, but she was obliged sometimes to wait a long and weary time until her daughter-in-law thought she could make it convenient to come and help her. When she was longer than usual in coming, she would pretend to think that she thought some one else had done it, and as she came in would put up her hands in surprise and exclaim, "Well, I declare, are you waiting here yet, Granny? Why, Lisa, what in the world have you been about? Why haven't you been here helping your grandmother?" Lisa would answer, when she took the trouble to answer at all, "I thought Hannah had seen to her." And Hannah, when appealed to, thought her mistress had attended to the matter. Maggie had gone out so early with her sheep every day that she had no opportunity of seeing all this. But when a severe storm came that kept them all at home for a day or two, she saw how affairs stood with poor Granny, and from that time forth stopped every morning to dress the old woman and help her downstairs to her pleasant bench before the door before she set out. How could Granny feel the soft warm rays shining on her poor old body without thinking of the kind-hearted little girl who thus repaid her for all the unkind things she had said and done to her? Had she been a Christian woman, she would have offered up many a prayer for the poor motherless child. But as it was, she only wondered how the child could so soon have forgotten her ill treatment. Granny was quite deaf too, and, like all other old people, was very curious to hear what was going on. Whenever she heard any noise in the spinning room, the sound of voices talking, and especially any good hearty shouts of laughter, she would look eagerly from one to the other and ask, "What? How? What are they saying?" and so on. Now and then one of them would stop and bawl a few words in her ear, but she saw very plainly that that was not all, and often the poor old creature concluded within herself that it was not worth while to inquire anything more. But now Maggie would come with her spindle and sit close to her. The child had a soft, sweet voice, as clear as the ring of a bell, and would repeat to her all that had been said, and do it in so droll a manner as to make the others redouble their screams of laughter, and old Granny joined in with them, the most amused and delighted of the party. On Sunday she would lead her out into the little garden, and though it obliged her to stay home from church, read her from the New Testament, or a sermon, or some prayers, and repeat the most beautiful hymns she knew. Thus the rich old woman and the orphan charity child became firm friends. It was strange to hear that little creature teaching her aged companion the way to heaven, and stranger still to see how the old woman hung upon every word the child said, when, as she often used to, she prayed to the dear and holy Saviour to open poor Granny's heart and help her to understand the Bible. It was pure kindness of heart that made Maggie take so much pains to make poor Granny happy. And yet there was another reason why she liked to be with her. She could talk to her about her own dear mother, whom every one else seemed to have quite forgotten. To be sure, it was not a great deal that even Granny knew to tell. "Your mother," said she once, "was born in this town, but went away when she was in her 14th year. Honour be to her memory. She was always a little proud and stuck up, and had a great longing for the city. It was said that she got into the service of great people, and went with them somewhere a long way off, and so for a long, long time nothing more was heard of her.
But after full 24 years she came back with you, and neither of you looked as if things had been going very well. She was still ill, for she had had the smallpox, which had pitted her face very much, and you were a miserable looking little thing about 2 years old. Who your father was I don't rightly know, but I believe he was a soldier. She never said much about him, nor about her master and mistress, only that they had not treated her well. The smallpox had left her nearly blind, so that all she could do was to spin, but as she was a master hand at that, she always got plenty of work about here. She never got perfectly well, and when she died, my daughter-in-law took you, which made me angry enough at the time, but I don't know what I should have done now without you."
This was all that Maggie could ever learn about her parents, but she thought of it over again and again, and filled up the gaps with all manner of strange and wonderful things from her own imagination. Her dream that she was a queen, with a golden crown upon her head, often came into her mind, she did not know why, and so did all the wonderful stories she had ever heard of high-born children who had been carried off in their childhood and passed their lives in obscurity, particularly when she was alone in the field, watching her sheep, with no employment but knitting, would her busy brain be filled with such things. But then, too, in the midst of them, she would remember what the church pastor said once, when he preached to the school children, and which she had thought of many times since. He had said,
"My dear children, remain gladly in your lowly state, and thank God that He has put you there, for there you are free from those dreadful temptations that beset the rich and great. Be more careful to become wise than to grow rich, and you will have a rich reward hereafter."
Then she would make a wreath of daisies and put it on her head, and exclaim, "Here I am, Queen Maggie." End of chapter 1. Of A Queen by Ottilie WILDERMUTH, translated by Unknown. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Esther and Simonides. Chapter 2. Going Out in the World. Many pleasant years passed for those who lived at the farm, and Maggie, still poor Maggie the charity child, when Lisa or the mother spoke of her to those before whom they wished to appear of importance, had grown to be a pretty, bright-looking, active girl, with her clear, honest eyes still undimmed, and her skilful hand still more useful and handy. She was a neat, delicate, pretty girl, and even when sent to sweep out the stable or scatter manure in the field, was far more refined and ladylike in her appearance than many a rich girl in the ballroom. A little queen she was indeed, although the willing servant of the whole family. The farmer did nothing that he wanted particularly well done without her advice. The mother unhesitatingly left house and barn to her care whenever a christening or a church festival tempted her from home. The servants all loved her, for she shrunk from no kind of work, took her share willingly of all that was to be done, and never got angry at their blunders. And to poor old Granny, who was now seldom able to leave her little room, she was a ministering angel. There was not one in the house that looked upon her unkindly, not one who was not willing to be her subject. Lisa, too, had grown to be a tall, stout girl, and was very anxious to be considered pretty. It was no fault of her own if she was not admired, for she wore the most brightly coloured handkerchiefs pinned around her neck, and hung herself about with ribbons and collars, and all other kinds of finery in great abundance. But it was, as everybody said, of no use. When she strutted about on Sundays with her new red calico gown, the boys followed her and cried, "Fire!" while Maggie, in her short homespun skirt and black bodice, the clean linen chemisette, and little black quilted cap, looked 1,000 times more beautiful. In every movement Lisa was awkward and clumsy, and more than once heard it whispered, "The young lady is not half so well looking or genteel as the maid." Maggie never went to the dance, but Lisa did very often, and was always asked, "Why did you not bring your pretty maid with you?" It made her very angry to be questioned in this way, as if she were going out in the company of a charity girl. Nor was that her only annoyance. Maggie had so pleasant a face, such agreeable manners, and so ladylike an air, that people were always taking her for the daughter of the house, even though Lisa stood there, dressed out in her gayest finery. All this vexed Lisa beyond description. She hated Maggie, and did all she could to harm her, and to be hated by anyone is a gnawing worm to a warm heart, however undeserved the hatred may be. With George the case was entirely different. He had become a fine-looking young man, and an excellent farmer, but he was very still and reserved, and used as few words as possible. He was now old enough to marry, and his father was very desirous that he should bring into the house some rich and important farmer's daughter. But he was resolved to do no such thing, no matter how often his father took him to the different houses in the neighbourhood, or how much vexed they seemed to be at his delay. At last he said to his mother in confidence, "Mother, I will do nothing, will bring no wife into the house without your consent, but go where I will, I see nobody to compare with Maggie, so lively, so industrious, so sensible and sweet-tempered. I know well that it would not be proper to marry her, but as long as I cannot find another like her, I should prefer not to marry." The more innocent Maggie was, the more angry were the parents that the poor girl should be the means of preventing her son from taking a wife suitable to his wealth and position. Lisa saw it all, and, stupid as she was about other things, she was cunning enough to keep her father and mother in a state of constant excitement. Indeed, she was the most interested person in the whole matter, and managed to insinuate herself into the good graces of everyone, or at least tried to, even with poor old Granny, who, she was very much afraid, was going to make Maggie her heir, and whom she tried in every way to convince that there would be no peace in the house as long as that girl remained in it. Maggie soon saw how matters stood, that the feelings of all were changed towards her, and she saw too the reason. It was not her nature to live in the midst of strife as long as there was any way of escaping from it, and she began to think what way should be. One very fine Sunday, Granny sat once more in the garden, and Maggie was reading the Bible to her. It was a story of Abraham, how the Lord gave him the command, "Go out from thy country and thy people into a land which I will show unto thee." Maggie let the book fall upon her lap as she asked, "What do you think, Granny? If I should go out from my people and my country, will the Lord lead me to the place where I ought to go?" "What do you mean, Maggie?" asked the old woman in alarm. "You do not mean to go away?" "I don't know," replied Maggie. "I don't know where I should go, but the lady in the town to whom I carry butter knows a very nice service for me, and I thought I had better take it than stay here, and that everything is so changed." And she began to cry. "You are right, poor child, everything is changed. Old and stupid as I am, I can see that," said Granny. "But it is no fault of yours, and you are quite right to go instead of staying here, to be domineered over by everybody. What will become of me when you are gone, only God knows. But I know very well why they want to drive you away from me. Only they will find themselves mistaken." When the farmer and his wife heard of Maggie's resolution, they were much alarmed, for well they knew that they could get no one to supply her place. Her watchful eye and skilful hand could not easily be replaced. At first they rated her soundly as a most ungrateful girl, for leaving those who had done so much for her, and raised her, as they said, out of the dust. After thinking longer of it, however, they concluded that it was best she should go, and freely gave her their consent. When the day came for her to leave, it seemed as if everything were forgotten, and the whole farm was a scene of grief, as though they were all taking leave of a dear friend. The younger children clung screaming to her skirts, and would not quit their hold. The mother was constantly thrusting something into her bundles, ample folds of fine linen, or some dried fruit, lest she should get hungry on her way, and thus she sought to conceal her grief and express her love. Stephen and his son George had taken leave of her early in the morning, before they went into the field. But under pretence that he had forgotten something, the farmer came back again, and as he again shook hands with her, he slipped some money into her fingers, and said, "There, that is for a keepsake, and if things do not go well with you, just come back again, at any hour, by night or by day. You know that here is your home." The farm servant and the maid, for since Maggie had grown up they kept but one, wept with the rest. Only Lisa remained gladly in her room, and at parting hardly gave Maggie her hand, while the latter bid her adieu with these words, "Forgive me, Lisa, if at any time I have done you any harm, and do not remember it against me." The last thing Maggie did was to run off to the room where poor old Granny sat, the most sorrowful of all. "I shall not be here long after you're gone," said the poor old woman. "Trust in God, Maggie, as you have always done. He will take care of you." "Granny," said Maggie, "I want you to make me a promise." "Well, what is it?" demanded the old lady. Well, Granny, I know that you have some little money, and that you want things to go well with me in this world. But if you have had it in your mind to leave any of your money to me when you die, I beg earnestly that you won't do it. I'll take it just as kindly as if you had, but I beg you, Granny, grant my request if you love me. And you do, don't you, Granny?" "You little goose," said Granny. "Never in my life did I hear anyone ask such a thing. Now, you are young and strong, to be sure, but if you live as long as I have, the time will come when you will be very glad to have a little laid by. If I work as long as I am able, and pray as I ought to God, He will not let me starve, nor leave me to beg when I am old. That I am very sure of. They shall never have it to say that I took care of you, and treated you kindly, for the sake of what you had to leave." "Yes, yes, you are not so wrong after all, and it shall be as you say," replied Granny. "But tell me, beside a little bit of pride, you've got that queen in your head yet, haven't you? Girl, don't let yourself be tempted by the evil one, and do nothing with those great folks' thoughts of yours that you are so full of." "If God has anything wonderful in store for me," said Maggie, with the crimson blood rushing to her face, "He Himself will find a way to bring it out. He won't leave me to look for it." "So, so," murmured the old woman to herself. "So she has not forgotten it yet. Look here, Maggie," she added aloud, "I won't leave you anything if you would rather have it so, but there is my little book with the silver clasp. That I will give you to remember me by. It was given me a long, long time ago by my mother, but I don't need it any longer. There is one verse that I have marked and turned down for you to think of when all those thoughts about great folk come into your head, for it tells me about the right kind of greatness. You taught me, Maggie, though you were a little child, and I a grown-up woman, how to go to my Saviour, and for it, if for nothing else, may His blessing rest ever upon you, and may the peace that I have found through your teachings be yours forever." Maggie read the verse marked down. "Grant, Lord, unto my prayers a royal noble soul, a regal heart such as beseems one who is wedded to thy cross, a heart that spurns what earth esteems most rich and great as naught but dross." This she read over and over again, and it went to her heart. She went away loaded with Granny's blessings and good wishes. The children accompanied her to the bounds of the farm. Then they all took leave of her, and she went on alone. She had not gone far, though, when under a tree she saw George waiting for her, but, quite unable to say a word for his tears, he could only hold out his hand to her. Maggie's heart was as full as his. "God bless you, George. Be a good son to your father and mother," said she, and passed on. But when, with her little heart bursting with sorrow, she came to the town gate, and was striving to make her way through the crowd that was pouring into it, she was quite surprised to hear all the bells ringing loudly. She could not imagine the reason of it, for it was not a church day, and she thought that perhaps there was a wedding. But the sound of the bells filled her with trust. "There is one God over us all," said she, "and a church everywhere, so one is never alone." And calmly, as though she knew just what awaited her, and was quite contented to meet it, the little queen entered her new kingdom. End of chapter 2. Of A Queen by Ottilie WILDERMUTH, translated by Unknown. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Esther Simonides. Chapter 3. Room to Do Good, or The New Home. Town life and town service were like a new world to Maggie, and it needed some little time for her to become accustomed to them. But whoever seeks earnestly to fulfil the duties entrusted to him, and finds pleasure in so doing, will not long remain awkward. The colonel's lady soon began to boast to her friends what a neat, willing, handy, and obliging servant she had found, and the colonel himself was much delighted with the quiet, unobtrusive way in which she taught the other maids in the house, by her own example, to pay proper respect to their employers. Just as a lady takes pride in decorating her drawing room, so did Maggie in the neatness and cleanliness of her bright, pleasant-looking kitchen; and the more carefully she studied, by the strictest economy, to promote the interests of her master, the more readily did her mistress consent to add, from time to time, to the kitchen furniture such articles as she thought would be desirable. But the colonel could not remain long in the little town, which was not far from the farm. He was obliged to go to the capital, taking his family, and of course the indispensable Maggie, with him, so that she was able to pay but one visit to the old home for which she still felt a strong affection. She left Granny at the point of death, and it was a comfort to her to know that the poor old woman would have gone to a rest before she was removed so far from her. But if Maggie had admired the wonders and beauties of the town, who can describe her astonishment and admiration at the wide streets and splendid buildings of the capital? And when she had seen even the outside of the king's palace, how heartily she laughed to herself at the remembrance of her dream, and of the fancies she had built upon it. The colonel's family occupied a large, well-furnished house, and Maggie was at no loss to find companions in the neighbourhood. The stylish servants of the neighbourhood were kind, and tried very kindly to introduce her to what they considered as the pleasures and enjoyments of city life. "Are you going to the market?" asked one of them, one day, stopping at the garden gate, with a basket on her arm. "Yes," replied Maggie, rather annoyed, however, that her new acquaintance, in accosting her, had used the word you, as if it had been one lady speaking to another, instead of the less pretending thou, by which persons of their class always address each other, and are addressed by those above them. Nor is it as a mark of contempt that a mistress says to her servant, thou instead of you, which she would say to her visitor. It is rather as a kind familiarity, for it is thus that dear and intimate friends always address each other, while you is employed only in cases of ceremony and politeness, in speaking with strangers, and with those in whom the speaker feels but little interest, or in expressing displeasure at those to whom one is accustomed, at other times, to say thou. No wonder, then, that Maggie felt somewhat vexed at the foolish airs of her neighbours. She showed her good sense by not following the example, and the girl dropped it. "How much market money were you able to make in L?" asked the stranger, this time more modestly, saying thou in German. "Market money? And what is that?" asked Maggie. "Oh, now, don't pretend such stupid innocence. Every one knows well enough what that is," answered her companion. "Why, you know that butter and eggs bring different prices almost every day, and everybody, naturally enough, wants to buy them as cheaply as possible. So when you go to reckon up with your mistress, you just make out that you got something less than you really did, and keep that for yourself. And you have a right to it. You earn it by trying to get as much as you can for your things. In that way you make a little money every week, and you wouldn't believe what a nice little sum it comes to at the end of the year, while the mistress doesn't miss it, and knows nothing about it." Maggie felt no temptation to try any such deception. She was quite disgusted with the bare thought of it, but she concluded at first that perhaps it would be better, for the sake of good feeling, not to make any reply, but to act as if she had not heard the remark. The royal spirit, however, rose within her, and turning to her companion, she said, "God keep me from such an act! It is as much stealing as if the money were taken out of the mistress' chest. Are you not afraid that the little money you make in that way will make you lose much more honestly earned?" And turning her back upon her new acquaintance, she found her way to the market by herself. Another of her new friends invited her to an afternoon walk on a holiday in one of the city gardens. It is a very usual thing in Germany, where the poorer people have so very little time to enjoy themselves, for peaceable, orderly people to go and take a quiet walk in the public squares and gardens on a holiday, not to indulge in dissipation by any means, but for a sight of the fresh green grass, and a breath of the sweet pure air that the great God has bestowed upon his world. This holiday proved to be a clear, bright, sunny day in March, and Maggie, who pined for the fresh air, willingly accepted the invitation. At first she enjoyed it very much. There were many neat, cheerful-looking maids there, sitting upon the benches or walking up and down the paths, laughing and chatting together. It brought to Maggie's mind the calm, quiet Sundays in the country, where everything was so peaceful and the air so sweet, and it made her feel almost homesick. Presently, however, some of the soldiers came and began to amuse themselves with the girls. They invited them to drink beer, and then they began dancing. Poor Maggie! How shocked she was to see such rude gaieties as these, and how dreadfully ashamed to find herself in such company. By and by, a noisy corporal, thinking he was doing the strange servant a great honour, began to compliment her on her good looks, and asked her to dance with him. Suddenly the gay, merry music seemed to ring out Granny's hymn, "A regal heart such as become," etc., etc., and she coolly replied, "Thank you, sir, I would rather not accept the invitation." "Ah!" said the offended corporal, turning towards the rest, "the young woman seems to have made a mistake. She thought she was coming to church." "I think myself that I have made a mistake," said Maggie quietly, and she got up and walked out of the garden. But wild and rude as the party had become, not one ventured to ridicule or follow her. The colonel's wife was a most excellent woman, but her husband's position obliged her to keep up a large circle of acquaintances, which kept her almost constantly engaged with visits and land parties, as they are called in Germany, a mode of amusement resembling our picnics. This she deeply regretted, because it obliged her sometimes to neglect her husband and children. During the week the children were at school, and on leisure afternoons they either visited or received the visits of other children, as is customary in their country, or went with their parents to walk and enjoy the fresh air. But on Sunday mornings the whole house was in an uproar with their noisy play, and their quarrels over their toys. "Maria!" Alfred would exclaim, "what are you doing with those building blocks? Girls don't build! Give them to me this instant!" "Well, I will," replied Maria, "if you give me back my porcelain figures." "No," said Alfred, "I want them myself. They must stand up in the balcony of my house when I get it built." While this was going on in one part of the nursery, little Milly from another screamed out that "Gustavus had taken her pretty dolly, and was going to paint whiskers and moustaches on her face." Maria, in revenge, knocked down Alfred's half-built house, and in a few moments there was a real tumult, such as all their sport ended with, of one kind or another. For some time Maggie saw all this with pain, and knowing well that the mother could not help it, turned over in her own mind the best way of putting a stop to it. At the farm the children were no angels, but the farmer and his wife had never suffered such an uproar and confusion in the house at any time, least of all on Sundays. "Sh, children, this is Sunday," was a cry to which they were taught to pay immediate attention. One Sunday morning Maggie determined to see what could be done, and, making more than usual haste to get through with her few duties on that day, she went directly to the nursery. The children were all fond of her, and she found herself in the midst of half a dozen drawn battles. "Why," she exclaimed, looking round her in pretended astonishment, "what kind of play do you call this? If this is your fashion of amusing yourselves, and on Sunday too, I must say I don't admire it. Now, when we were all children at the farm, our Sunday mornings were the most delightful time of the whole week. We didn't play, for we had nothing to play with, so we didn't care to do so." "That must have been very nice, to be sure," said Alfred contemptuously. "We were very happy, whether you believe it or not," replied Maggie. "In the first place, if they wouldn't take us to church, we had a service of our own at home. The great tree in the dooryard was the roof of our make-believe church, because it spread its branches so nicely over our heads. The top of the tree was the steeple, and the shade on the ground where we sat was the church floor. First we sang all the most lovely hymns we could find. Oh, but I believe you can't sing much," she added hesitatingly. "Can't sing!" exclaimed Maria indignantly. "And we take lessons from Madame Milano!" "And in school we sing every day of our lives," said Alfred doggedly. "Oh, well then," said Maggie, as if she felt quite satisfied and relieved, "then I will show you how we used to play church. First, as I said before, we must sing. Since you can sing so nicely, suppose we choose a choral. Now let us choose a very pretty one. Suppose we sing 'How sweetly beams the star of morn.' Now pay attention. Maria, you sing the second, you, Alfred, sing the tenor, and I will take the air, for I am not musical scholar enough to sing from the notes. I can only sing a tune after I have learned it. Now begin." Maggie, even as she said, was no great musical scholar, but she had a sweet clear voice, and at once she began singing that exquisite hymn, the children falling in with their appointed parts, for in German schools the poorest children are taught to read music and sing by note, as regularly as they are to read their Bibles. This, to be sure, was not a very finished performance, for Maggie's voice was untrained, and it was the first time they had ever sung together; but all parties were highly satisfied, not excepting even Gustavus and Milly, who chose to assist Maggie. "There," said Maggie, when the hymn ended, "now we must read." "Oh, yes, yes!" exclaimed Alfred in great delight. "Bring Maria's new story book." "What?" cried Maggie, opening her eyes. "That? For Sunday? And in church too? Just you wait one moment, until I go and get my Bible, and read you something from that, and then tell me if it is not prettier than Tom Thumb, or even than Cinderella with her glass slipper, besides being all true. I'll read Joseph." "Oh, we knew that by heart long ago!" exclaimed the two elder ones in the same breath. "But listen to it once more," said Maggie, and she opened the Bible and began to read, while the children all listened with the greatest attention, the two younger ones from curiosity to hear the story, the two elder to find if it were not the same old one that they professed to have so long known by heart. But Maggie read aloud worse than she did anything else, notwithstanding she had done it so often for poor old granny. Her voice was not strong enough. Alfred got quite impatient, and at last declared that he thought he could do it a great deal better. Maggie had not the least objection to letting him try, and as it proved, so he did. When she gave him the book, she was herself quite astonished to hear how clear and distinct his words were, and how exactly he read as if he were talking. The little ones, who had never before heard the story, became so excited that the elder ones grew doubly so, and kept saying to them, "Now listen! Now the prettiest part is coming!" And the little things would open their eyes and mouths still wider, and hitch their chairs still closer. Maria, too, wishing to show what she could do in the way of reading, and so it was agreed to take turns all round. The story read, Maggie said that the next thing in order was to preach, but as only real clergymen could do that, she would just explain to them a little about the story of Joseph, as a schoolmaster used to do to them when they were children. So she told them how, in that country where Joseph and his brothers lived, a man was not rich, not according to the money he had, but to the cattle and sheep and goats and camels and servants that he owned. Joseph's father was a very great and rich man, and owned great numbers of all these things. But, like all the rest of his countrymen, even their princes, he sent his own sons out into the fields to take care of them. The fields, she said, were not large or small bits of land with a fence round each. The whole country was open, and belonged as much to one man as to another. Wherever there was a large quantity of grass, and of course a nice spring of water, there they would drive their animals, and leave them to enjoy themselves, while the owner's son, or his servants, or both, watched that no harm befell them. When the grass was all eaten close, they drove off the animals to some other point, and left it to grow again. That was the reason, perhaps, that Joseph had to go to 2 or 3 different places before he could find his brothers. Maggie made them observe, too, how the great God had taken care of little Joseph, and made him a favourite with everybody, wherever he went, because he was such a dutiful and obedient child to his father, and always spoke the truth, and how he punished the brothers for their unkindness to Joseph, and especially for the wicked lie they told their father about the little coat. Even though they did not tell the lie plainly, but only led their father to suppose that they had found the coat in that bloody condition, it was, nevertheless, just as much a lie as if they had told him so, and God punished it accordingly. And then, too, see how long it was before the punishment came. Why, every one of them had grown old enough to be married and have children, and Joseph himself, though he went up little by little, had had time to become the greatest man in Egypt, except the king. Yet God did not forget it; it came at last. And so, the schoolmaster used to tell us, it was always. God has told us in the 10 Commandments we must not do a good many things. We must not steal, nor lie, nor tell things about other people that are not true, for that is what it means by bearing false witness, and so on. And if we do them, just so surely we may know we shall be punished, even if the punishment does not come for years and years. Everybody thought that Maggie's explanations were almost as interesting as the story, and the Sunday morning passed more quickly than ever one had passed before, and far more pleasantly. The next Sunday they were quite ready for the same employments, and thus many a good seed was sown in their young hearts, upon which the affectionate servant maid daily besought a merciful God to shed the warmth and dew of his blessing, that they might spring up and bear fruit abundantly. Maggie had founded here another little kingdom, where she reigned as undisputed queen. The first day that they had moved into their new residence, Maggie had heard a great coughing, hawing, and hemming from the story above, and at last it became so violent that she left what she was doing and went to see what could be the matter. Now, our little readers must understand that in the large cities of France and Germany, a single family seldom occupies a whole house by itself, as in England. only a few of the most wealthy can afford to do that. Their houses are very large as well as high, and built in such a manner that each story is like a house by itself, and those who live in the upper ones can go up and down without disturbing or annoying the families below them any more than if they lived in different houses. The richest people in each house live on the first story, those not quite so well off on the second, and so on. The poorer they are, the higher they will live. And so in a house in which on the first floor you will find a nobleman, will have in the attic a poor sempstress, in one room a poor bandbox maker in another, a washerwoman in the third, etc., etc. It was thus that Maggie, while cleaning the rooms of her mistress, heard all this coughing from overhead, and ran up to see what it could mean. There sat an old gentleman in a dirty-looking, ragged dressing-gown in front of his stove. In Germany they do not have fireplaces, as we have, the door of which was open, and he was toiling and striving to kindle some sticks of wood that kept throwing out great quantities of smoke, but positively refused to burn. "Do you wish to light it, sir?" asked Maggie. "Indeed I do," replied he, looking sorrowfully at the open door, "for I am very cold, but it is too obstinate. I can get no fire." "Let me try, sir," said Maggie, pleasantly. The old gentleman readily allowed her to do so, and she soon produced a blaze, over which the old gentleman rejoiced not a little. Maggie begged that she might be allowed, if her mistress would permit her, to perform that little service for him every morning, a permission the lady did not hesitate a moment to give. "Do what you will for him, Maggie," said the kind mistress. "Only bear in mind, my child, that you will receive nothing from him for your services. From what I have heard of him, he must be very poor." But recompense was not in Maggie's mind. No one could think what a load was taken from the worthy old gentleman, who was the learned professor, Dr. Wormer, when so willing and skilful a person offered to make his fire for him. He was very grateful to his new friend, and resolved to become better acquainted with her. He was very old, but a distinguished scholar, and an author of some note beside. He wrote untiringly, stories for the young, stories for the people, books popular and books philosophical. He wrote all kinds of things, and gathered his materials from a mass of volumes, new and old, with which his entire bedroom, as well as his ordinary living room, was so piled up that scarcely could his writing desk and his bed find a place in the vast sea of miscellaneous learning. But all his writing did not bring him even as much as his books had cost him. He was poor, and had not a single relative in the world. His only servant was a small boy, who came 3 times each week to do his errands. His bed he made himself, his room somebody had once cleaned up for him, and the landlord was even now afraid that if somebody did not do it again, his floors would at last become like the ground itself, from the heaping up of the dirt upon them. But the former cleaning had so dreadfully disturbed the quiet, hard-working old man, that he could not bear to try it again. To the order-loving, neat Maggie, therefore, the poor landlord had communicated his fears, when she obtained permission from the old man, one afternoon, to dust and arrange his books. She sent him out to take a walk, and then, with brush, broom, and dusting cloth, set to work, for a sad-looking place it was. Sometimes, in the midst of her labours, she would have to stop short, and then she clapped her hands and laughed merrily at the sight of the heaps of dirt and the heaps of books that lay side by side. The old man clapped his hands and laughed merrily too, when he came back and saw the order in which the books had been arranged. To be sure, they were all put neatly back upon the shelves in the most regular order possible, but without the slightest regard to their contents. Size and binding seemed to have been the only points of resemblance that Maggie had consulted. Consequently, a geography was placed close beside a prayer book, or a volume of French plays leaned against a Bible. It took him no little time to get them right again, but he did not mind that in the least, for now the fresh air had room to circulate through his chambers, and the clear, bright sunlight could pass through the glass of his windows without being buried in the dust on them. Maggie had won the doctor's heart completely. He loved her as if she had been his own daughter, and since he had no other way of showing his affection, he offered to lend her as many books as she wanted, an offer that gave her much pleasure, though she had but little time for reading. It was a recompense that expressed the gratitude of the old man, and showed she had made him really happy, for though in all she had done she had never thought of a reward, she had earnestly hoped that she might be permitted to give a little happiness to the desolate, lonely old man. Maggie's simple heart, filled with an earnest wish to do as the great God had commanded her, never left an opportunity unimproved of doing an act of kindness, to those who had no one else to do it for them. The words still rang in her ears that the venerable schoolmaster had said to her the day she left his care, when he laid his trembling hand upon her smooth shining hair and said, "My daughter, never forget that you are the follower of him who while on earth went about doing good, and who commanded those who would be his to follow him. Remember that he himself has said, 'Whatsoever ye shall do to one of the least of these, ye do it unto me.'" And faithfully she strove to follow his counsel, nor did she ever find the promise to fail, "Ye shall in no wise lose your reward." This thought gave additional value to the old man's offer to lend her his books, and on Sunday afternoons, when she took turns with the housemaid in having a holiday, on the days when her turn came, she would go, after church, into the garden, and seating herself in the shade, enjoy the perfect repose of quiet happiness within and without. The housemaid whom she had offended that day on her way to the market, by the manner in which she had spoken of the market money, had been from that time her worst enemy. Nevertheless, Maggie's remark had somewhat disturbed her conscience, so that she never felt sins quite easy. She now began little by little to come round and try to make up with Maggie, who, not having the least ill feeling towards her, received her very kindly. Other girls of the neighbourhood, too, finding how pleasantly Maggie spent her Sundays, came in now and then to share them, if she would allow. And, though sorry for the interruption, she felt better pleased to have them there than to know they were somewhere in the public gardens. So sometimes she would read to them, sometimes walk up and down in the pleasant air, and repeat to them what she had before read, or sometimes get them all seated in some quiet spot, while they sang pretty hymns, or read by turns stories from the Bible. The next morning these girls found that they were always ready to begin the week's work in better health and spirits than when they went to the dance and lost their time and money without getting any return. God has promised, "Them that honour me, I will honour." End of chapter 3. Of a Queen by Ottilie WILDERMUTH. Translated by Unknown. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Esther and Simonides. Chapter 4. Great Expectations, or the Doctor's Daydream. The doctor took a very deep interest in the kind-hearted girl. She seemed to have so much more refinement of idea and manners than was usual with girls of her position in life, that he found it difficult to believe her really the child of plain peasant people. She chattered to him as she would have done to her father, told him all she knew of her childhood, all about the farm, for which she, even yet, felt a little homesick, of the pleasant times when she took care of the sheep, and even of the Queen dream, and how she had been joked and teased about it. "And what is most foolish of all, doctor," she would say, "is that to this very day I can't get it out of my head, and I don't believe I ever shall. Sometimes I determine to think of something else, but try as hard as I will, there it is, and it mixes itself up with everything else, and I can't help it." "Indeed, is that really so?" asked the doctor with great interest, for, from having passed his life more among books and the kind of world described in them than among real living men and things, he had great faith in the wonderful, and then he would add, thoughtfully, "Yes, yes, there must be something in him. There is something in you, Maggie, that is not common, even if you are not a princess by right. All this ought to be cleared up. Who were your parents, really?" Maggie told him what she had learned about them from Granny, and that was all she knew. All she said, though, seemed to but impress the wonder-loving old gentleman more and more that there was some mystery about the matter. He seemed quite sure that, as he had often read in foolish novels, she must be some great man's daughter, lost or stolen in her infancy, and entitled to a vast fortune and high rank if she could but prove her rights. So he asked her one day whether, among the things that her mother had left, there was not something that would throw light upon the matter. "No," said Maggie, "nothing but what any poor peasant woman might be supposed to leave behind her. But then she sold a great many things to relieve her poverty, all her best clothes among other things, and I wore her old gowns for a long, long time, as long as they would hang together. But, oh yes!" she exclaimed, suddenly recollecting herself, "there was one nice thing in her chest, and I've got it now. It was a beautiful pocket handkerchief, all elegantly embroidered, and a beautiful crown worked in the middle of it. And then I've a beautiful neckband too, with a golden ducat sewn to it. I used to wear it when I was a little child, because my mother said it was good for the eyes. She told me my godfather had given it to me, but who he was I never knew." "Have you it with you here?" asked the doctor, eagerly, for he was becoming more and more interested, and began to feel very sure that it was going to turn out as things did in the story books. "Yes, sir," replied Maggie, "but they both are down in the bottom of my chest. The first leisure hour I have I will look for them and show them to you; but just now I must go, for I have stayed too long talking here."
"Just one moment more, my child,"
cried out the old man as he went off. But Maggie had duties waiting for her, and away she went. The worthy doctor could not drive all this out of his head. He thought of all the stories he had ever read or heard of children that had been wronged, lost, or disinherited. He thought of the story of Caspar Hauser, and everybody like him that he could bring to his mind, and the more he considered the pleasant manners, the refined air and taste, her natural delicacy of feeling, or her natural abhorrence of everything rude, common, or vulgar, the more convinced he felt that she could not be the child of a poor spinning woman. The doctor was a true and earnest Christian, but he had been, all his life long, so shut up among his books and devoted to his studies, that he had been very little among his fellow creatures, not enough to have observed them as closely as he ought. He knew that the love of God purifies the heart and drives out all that is sinful, but he did not know that the light of religion in the soul glows through the face and gives it an expression of gentle sweetness and refinement, while the daily practice of its precepts produces a refinement and polish of manners such as no court can give. He did not know that the simplest, plainest peasant woman, who, loving God and trying day by day to obey him, and do as his word commanded, if placed beside the greatest lady in the land, whose politeness was only acquired in society, would be found to be really the more polished of the two. Maggie's personal appearance was not very aristocratic. She was stout, strong, and rosy, and had none of that slenderness of form and delicacy of feature and complexion that one would expect to see in a young princess. But that, thought the good old man, is because she has had to work so hard all her life. She certainly has a pair of eyes as bright as the light. So she had, for they danced with pleasure at the sight of others' happiness, or the opportunity of contributing to it. She abhorred all things vulgar, because she had learned to love the things of God, which were refined and pure. Her manners were uncommonly ladylike, because she was accustomed to practice the precepts of the Holy Bible, which bade her to show respect to the aged and to all her betters, to do to others as she would like them to do to her, not to think of herself, but to think of the comforts and happinesses of others, and as far as lieth in her, to do good to all men. Little as the doctor generally troubled himself about the affairs of other people, he now set to work to study closely all the gazettes, and to search through all the books of heraldry, to trace out the families of all the noble and princely houses of Germany, in hopes of getting some light thrown upon the subject. Maggie, too, much as she laughed about it, and hard as she tried to get it out of her mind, could not help thinking, day and night, of the doctor's conjectures, and had hardly patience enough to wait for Sunday, that she might have an hour's quiet talk with him. But even for that she never deserted her church, though in the depths of heart she was grieved that she could not prevent her thoughts from wandering away from what she was doing. It was not until the next Sunday afternoon that she had the opportunity of showing him the handkerchief and neckband, and the old gentleman put on his best spectacles to examine them. The handkerchief was somewhat yellow from long keeping, but it was of the finest linen cambric, and in the centre, worked with a needle, the coronet of a count, below which were the initials M.V.H.
"There now!" cried the delighted old man. "How came such a thing as that into the possession of a poor spinning woman, I should like to know?"
"But she was at the service, you know," said Maggie timidly, "and might have received it as a present from her mistress."
"Nonsense!" exclaimed the doctor with scornful incredulity. "Do people present such things as that to their servants' maid, unless they want to see them taken up for stealing? And steal it! That your mother never did in this world!"
"No, sir, indeed she never did!" exclaimed Maggie, quickly and eagerly.
"Now let us look at number 2, said the doctor.
And he held up the velvet neckband, trimmed with beads of amber, and from the middle was suspended a golden ducat, evidently a christening gift. Upon one side of this medal was represented a castle, upon the other, richly engraven, a coat of arms, with a few words that Maggie had never been able to make out. The doctor, however, by dint of hard study, aided by his spectacles, at last discovered all about it, and, starting up with a cry of joy, exclaimed,
Yes, yes, that's it. Marguerite, Countess von Hohenstein, 1815. Yes, this is the coat of arms of the family von Hohenstein, one of the oldest and proudest in the empire. And these two are the initials under the coronet on the handkerchief, M.V.H. The band was, of course, as with every other child, put round your neck when you were baptized, as a sort of label in case you should ever be lost. This shows the propriety of that German custom of ours. Yes, yes, it's as plain as day now. You are the child of the Countess von Hohenstein. Marguerite, that is Margaret, and so those country folks got it down to Maggie."
"But why should they—" Maggie stopped short, for everything seemed to swim round her.
"Send you away or give you away, you mean, don't you?"
said the doctor, finishing the question for her.
Oh, there may have been 100 reasons for that. Disputes about the property, rival claims, domestic quarrels. Oh, 100 reasons. Then, too, your birth seems to have occurred the year of the war, when everything was unsettled and upside down, and so it may have been in your family. Oh, it's all just as plain as can be."
But to Maggie it was not so very plain, and she was obliged to sit down with her head upon her hands, for she could hardly tell whether all this were a dream or a reality. The good man, though, was as sure as his heart could desire, and very full of zeal.
"Oh, we mustn't hurry matters too much,"
said he, gathering up all his books of genealogy and heraldry.
"I must first make myself thoroughly familiar with all these. I must first get by heart, as it were, all the branches of the family for some time back, so as to strike exactly the right point. Now I have all I want in the way of facts. So you, dear child, just go to your own little room, and pray earnestly to God to direct me in my way, and it will all come right, I promise."
Maggie did go to her little room, and prayed with all her heart for support and guidance in this great event of her life. Then she went down to her duties, but her head was so full of what she had heard, that day, for the first time in her life, she was blamed for carelessness. She bore it meekly, however. She knew that when she explained it she would be heartily forgiven. But what would the Frau Oberstein, the colonel's lady, say when she found that her bed had been made, her rooms brushed, her shoes cleaned, and her windows washed by a countess? The doctor that Monday went in and out oftener than he had ever been known to do before. To Maggie he seemed to have nothing to say, except that, as he passed her, he would remark,
"All is going on very well. The prospect is very fair."
But on Friday morning, just as his fire began to burn briskly, he begged her before she went out to take out his best coat, and a coat of most extraordinary make and appearance it was, to brush and shake it well, and bring it to him, together with a ruffled shirt that she would find somewhere in the chest,
though we thought it must be near the bottom, for it was a very long time indeed since he had worn it.
Maggie stood quite astonished at such orders, and he looked at him to see if he were in earnest, but he replied by a nod, a kind smile, and a merry wink with one eye, saying,
"It's all on your account, child, all."
A stick with a silver knob was next brought from some hidden away corner of his wardrobe, and in this holiday array he descended the stairs and walked with a resolute step down the street, altogether unconscious of the gaze of the people he passed, or the laughter and jokes of the boys who followed him. To Maggie this dressing up was the more mysterious from the looks he had given her from time to time while it was going on, and to such a height was her curiosity raised, that, though his room was but half put in order, she could neither return to it nor settle her mind to anything else until he came back. And back he did come very soon, with a face blazing from his rapid walk, and an air 10 times more knowing, if possible, than before.
"It is almost entirely settled," said he to the startled girl. "Be sure you come to my room this very evening, for I have something of vast importance to tell you."
Oh, how long that day was, and how diligently Maggie did work that she might be able, the moment supper was over, to go to the old man's room! When she did at last start for it, she was forced to put down for a moment or two the lamp she held in her hand, lest she should let it fall, and then she had to sit herself down, so much did she tremble. When she got into the room she dropped into a chair.
"Now, my child," said the old man, "listen, and you shall hear all. I have found that, about the date of your birth, there lived a Countess Marguerite von Hohenstein, who, born in this country, passed afterwards into foreign lands. She had several children who all died. All the circumstances agree with my opinion, and, what is most extraordinary, the same countess is now living in this very city. Having learned all this, I started directly off, caused myself to be announced to the countess, laid before her all the evidences, and told her plainly that they were the property of a poor girl, now in that city, living at service."
"Well, and what did she say?" asked Maggie, eagerly.
She was astonished, seemed moved, but not at all as much as I expected. But great people are practised, you know, in concealing their feelings, and after thinking for a moment, said, "May I ask you, my dear sir, to bring this girl to see me as soon as may be?" I promised her, of course, with great pleasure, and paid her my respects quite naturally, but never in my life could I have believed that I could have spoken up so to quality, and felt so much at ease with the real countess. But yes, I know how that came about. It was just from having been friends so long with a young countess." And he laughed heartily at his own conceit.
"And do you really believe anything will come of it?" asked Maggie, who, to tell the truth, had expected more decided results.
"Believe? Why, there is no doubt. Else why would she want to see you? I promise to take you there early tomorrow morning, so dress yourself in your best."
"Oh, how fortunate!" exclaimed Maggie. "To-morrow my master and mistress are going on a picnic, and are to take all the children with them, so they have promised all the maids a holiday for the whole day."
Ay, my children," said the old doctor reverently. "Don't you see how all things work together for good to those who love the Lord? Recall your whole life, Maggie, and see if this is not so. And now good night. I shall not often tell you so after this."
And the poor gentleman seemed quite sad. When Maggie went to bed that night, she was for a long time so tired that she could not sleep. And yet when she thought of the truth of her dream, for in her eyes a queen and a countess were pretty much the same thing, and how it was coming out, she felt more fear than joy. Would she not be more likely to mortify and disgust than to please her lady mother? But then again she thought of how she should enjoy the surprise of the colonel and his lady, and above all of her fellow servants. She thought, too, of the astonishment of the folks at the farm. The wife, she who had felt too grand to receive the poor orphan as her daughter-in-law, would not she look amazed when the coroneted coach drove up, and the lady mamma with her newly found daughter alighted? And what would George say? Only that very day she had heard that he had not yet brought home a wife to the house. What a true heart he had, and oh, how delightful it would be to tell the whole world that the unknown peasant's son was the chosen bridegroom of the young countess! But then again, would her noble mother consent to such a bridegroom? Her brain was so full of all kinds of things that at last they all mingled together, and she fell asleep. When she awoke the next morning, her first thought was what an important day it was to be to her. Then she kneeled down and prayed her Heavenly Father to be with her through all that might come, good or bad. End of chapter 4. Five of A Queen by Ottilie WILDERMUTH, translated by Unknown. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Esther Simonides. Chapter 5. The Discovery. The picnic set out, and Maggie proceeded to dress herself. No small business, this time at least. She had already washed herself so clean that one would have supposed she meant it to last for a year. She had brushed and braided her hair until not one stray hair could be discovered, and the smooth bands that were passed behind her ears looked like folds of satin. But just as she came to the last ornament, it struck her for the first time that she ought to keep close to her country dress. It was very silly in her to attempt to dress like a town lady. That might seem like a mean imitation, while the other was neat and simple, and so she dressed herself as usual. She could not have looked prettier than she did when she walked into the old man's room, in the clean, dark Sunday gown, with the little cap and its band upon her glossy hair, the long rich braids of which hung down her back, the neckband fastened round her throat, and her fresh, rosy, innocent face lighted up with those great, clear brown eyes. Even the old doctor, fastidious as his anxiety had made him, looked at her with perfect satisfaction, and felt in his heart that even a countess might feel proud of her. They set out, Maggie's heart constantly breathing the unuttered prayer, "O Lord, do thou lead and guide me," and at last reached the fine hotel in which the countess lived. Maggie's heart beat fast as she stood in the ante-room, waiting for admission, but at last the door opened, and they were told to enter, for the lady was within.
"Here, your highness, is the girl of whom I spoke," said the stately doctor, leading in the trembling Maggie. "I have the honour to present her with my most humble respects," and he hurried off as fast as he could, though the countess called to him to stay. He thought an interview of this kind should take place without witnesses. The countess, a stately dame some 50 years old, robed in a dress of rich blue satin, sat in an easy-chair, and greeted the girl with a kind welcome. Maggie trembled from excitement in every limb, and the good countess, pitying her agitation, said gently, "Sit down, my child, sit down, and tell me if these things are really yours."
Really and truly, lady," replied Maggie solemnly.
And were they given you by your mother? What was her name?" asked the lady.
"Christine Hilarion von Velberg," replied Maggie.
"Did you ever know her? Where did she die?" asked the lady.
"I can hardly remember much about her now," said Maggie. "She lived at service somewhere far off, and soon after her return she became blind, and lost her health entirely. She used to spin for the farmer and his wife at the Tannenhof, the pine tree farm, and after her death they took me."
"Did she never tell you anything of her master and mistress?"
"No, not to me. Granny at the Tannenhof said that she had once said her master and mistress had not treated her well, but that was all."
"No wonder she thought so," said the countess,
her eyes filling with tears.
"Dear child, I was that mistress. You were the child of most worthy parents, and the blessing of their fidelity shall rest on you."
Maggie looked at the lady with a feeling of great relief, though matters had turned out so differently from what she had expected.
"Now listen to me," said the lady, "and I will tell you all about it, but it is a long story. My husband was in the army and absent a good deal. I was living here when your mother came into my service, and her faithfulness and devotion soon attached me to her strongly. The death of a brother made my husband heir to some property in Bavaria, and he got leave of absence and went to visit it. He took as his attendant a worthy soldier named Hilarion, a man who had long served him faithfully, and I took your mother to wait on me. Hilarion proved as useful on the estate as he had been in the camp or field, and affection sprung up between him and your mother, but the projected marriage was long delayed from their unwillingness to leave us. But they were both getting towards middle age, and at our persuasions the wedding at last took place. They went to live in a neat little house that my husband had built for them, cultivated a bit of ground of their own, and gave great assistance in the care of the estate. 1 year after that I held you at the baptismal font, and hung round your neck the amber neckband that you have brought back to me. About this time my husband was persuaded to take part in the Russian war, from which no one from the beginning boded any good, but he was fond of military glory, and Hilarion determined to go with him. Your worthy father had no other object than to be near and watch over his master and friend. I gave the estate in charge to a competent person, and went to Munich, taking with me your mother and yourself. Your excellent mother never seemed to me like a servant, and we shared together our hopes and fears. They had left us in June. In December my husband returned, sick, discouraged, and alone. Through all the perils of that fearful war, your father had stood with unshaken fidelity beside him. One night they were obliged to stay in a miserable cabin. The fire went out. My husband, benumbed with cold and hunger, was indistinctly aware, like someone in a dream, of having a skin wrapped round him. It was your father, who had for his sake taken the last covering from his own body. In the morning the count awoke, refreshed from a comfortable sleep, but your father was in that deeper sleep that has no awakening. He was frozen stiff. He had given up his very life for his master. Faithfully then we promised his sorrowing wife never to desert her or her child, but to repay to them, as far as God should give us the ability, the generous fidelity of the husband and father. One trouble seldom comes alone. We were on the point of setting out for Italy, whither my husband was going for the recovery of his broken health, when my 2 little daughters were taken ill with smallpox. I immediately gave permission to such of our servants as were afraid of the disease to leave the house, and all availed themselves of it, but your mother, who insisted on remaining. My time was so entirely taken up in the care of my husband that I was obliged to leave the children entirely to her, and she never left them, though still overwhelmed with grief for the death of your father. You, who were then a delicate child, were confided to the care of a worthy woman, and thus preserved from the infection. My little Emily died in her arms. The handkerchief with which she had wiped the death sweat from her face she kept as a remembrance of her. Clara, my youngest, thanks to her care and God's blessing upon it, recovered, and then preparations were made as rapidly as possible for the journey to Italy. The very evening before we were to start, your mother sickened. We were to leave at daybreak the next day, and the necessary passports and so on, rendered necessary by the unsettled state of the country, having all been made out and forwarded, the state of affairs altogether made it impossible to delay. Our housekeeper, who was the only one of our attendants to remain behind, was a woman in whom I had always had the most unbounded confidence, and to her care I gave my poor Christine, with the strictest injunctions to give her the same care and attention that she would have given me, and with the same disregard of expense. Above all, if she grew at any time dangerously ill, we were to be immediately informed of it, and if on the other hand she recovered, we were to be notified as soon as she was in a condition to come to us. For a long time I heard nothing from her, and my husband was so ill that I scarcely dared leave his bedside, so I could not make any very strict inquiries. The first leisure I had I wrote to the housekeeper, and received in reply the information that your mother had died of the smallpox, and that her child had soon followed her, from pure weakness and debility. My blind confidence in this woman had prevented me from knowing that covetousness and envy had made her, long before, your dear mother's most deadly enemy, for she looked upon Christine as one who had usurped the position she herself was entitled to hold in our family. Ignorant of this, however, I received her statement without a doubt, and every tie that bound me to Dresden being thus dissolved, for I had lived in too close seclusion to have made many friendships, I did not care to return, and so never had an opportunity of learning the truth of the case. For 4 years we went from one place to another, through Italy and Switzerland, for my husband's health was then entirely restored. Our hotel in Dresden was of course shut up, and the housekeeper dismissed, but before removing the furniture, I resolved to pay it one more visit, to see the grave of my Christine and learn something more of her last days. With great distress I there heard that the housekeeper, fearing herself the infection, had had her sent to the hospital, and by the assistance of the physician who attended her, had made her believe that it was by my husband's orders. That was trouble and grief enough, but I did not think I had any more to hear. Not finding her name on the death list of the hospital, I concluded that it had been an oversight, but certainly believed her dead, for so I had been assured, and we had heard or seen nothing to make me even suspect the contrary. Now, since the old gentleman, who has shown himself so deeply interested in you, has told me the tale that he has heard from you, it is clear to my mind that, after her recovery in the hospital, she left it and the city, in poverty and weakness, sick at heart at our base ingratitude, and went to hide her griefs in her humble birthplace. We had so certainly looked upon her as belonging to us, so little thought of her ever leaving us, that we had not taken care, as we ought to have done, to secure her an independence. This was an unpardonable oversight. If she had but asked us for the least thing, even a spot whereupon to stand her humble dwelling, but she always had a proud heart, and while she believed herself to have suffered at our hands such cruel injustice, she would have nothing to thank us for. Never shall I forgive myself that a friend, for we never looked upon her as a servant, a friend so faithful, so devoted, should have died away from us, and none but God knows how I have longed and prayed for some opportunity of repaying to some one dear to her the bitter wrongs I left her to bear. And now my prayer has been answered. His hand has in mercy led you to me, and to you, dear child, will I try to make up for it all. I am besides your godmother, and as my own only daughter is married, who can be so fit a person to take her place in my house and heart as the child of the woman who gave her own health and strength to save hers? Come and stay with me, Margaret. Come and be to me as a daughter, and let me feel that I have still about me one to love and trust." Poor Maggie had forgotten all the dreams of greatness, and was weeping over the sad fate of her parents, but at the same time she thanked God that they had left behind them such remembrances, and felt almost ashamed and humbled that she should have desired, even for a moment, to have been the child of any other mother. How delighted she was that the countess knew nothing of all the foolish thoughts the good old doctor had put into her head! She scarcely dared look at her, lest she should read her folly in her eye. The countess now promised her that she would come the next day to see the colonel and his wife, and beg them to release her. "And then," she said, "you shall remain hereafter with me, and may the Blessed One help me to take better care of you than I did of your poor mother." Deeply moved, yet with a heart vastly lighter than when she entered, Maggie returned home, thinking over all that had happened in the course of her young life, and admiring the strange and wonderful, yet very simple ways by which the Father in heaven had worked out the promise made to mothers
who, like hers, had tried hard to serve and honor him. Leave thy fatherless children unto me, and I will keep them alive. Not a single day had she ever passed, poor and parentless as she was, but she had had plenty to eat and drink and wear, a good fire when she was cold, and a good bed when she was sleepy. It had all seemed to come naturally. But whose hand had provided all these things? So much had happened that morning that she thought it must have been very, very long, and was astonished when she got home to find the servants just serving the dinner. The dear good old doctor, meantime, was restlessly walking up and down in his room, impatiently waiting her return. He expected nothing less than that she would come with the old countess in her coach, and already dressed as became her new rank. He wondered whether he would recognize her. Oh, could it be that she would not come home again at all? That she would just send a civil message to Colonel Oberstein and his wife, and in her good fortune forget her old friends? He was still debating the matter in his mind, when he heard her light, quick step upon the stairs, and the same identical Maggie, with a short woollen skirt, trimly dressed feet, and coquettish cap, sprang in, held out her hand to him, and between laughing and crying could not utter one single word.
Well, now, what is it?
Asked the doctor, eagerly. I am no countess at all, laughed Maggie.
And the fact, the coat of arms, the name?
Gasped the old man. Maggie gave another merry laugh. My mother was once a servant to the countess, who gave her those things, the handkerchief for herself, the chain to me when I was baptized.
Poor child, said the old man, with a face so long, and a tone of such intense pity, that out came another laugh from Maggie. But he went on, and I, old fool as I am, have been stuffing you with all those vain hopes, and doing all I could to make you discontented with the station you have filled so honourably. I have scattered all your pleasant dreams to the wind, and left you nothing but disappointment.
No, 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 said Maggie, taking his hand soothingly. You have no idea what a service you have done me. And as the old gentleman brightened up at that, she went on to tell him the whole story, just as she had heard it from the countess. And now, you see, she went on, not a word of this should I ever known, but for you, doctor. And now I can say before the blessed Father, who knows my heart, that to have heard what I have this day of my parents gives me more happiness than to have found myself a lady. And that I have heard it, I must thank you. Besides, doctor, just figure to yourself now how I should look running about with a long train to my dress, as young ladies do. Why, I'd 100 times rather sweep the streets with my broom than with my clothes. And the picture seemed so very ridiculous that she laughed merrily. The doctor, delighted at seeing her so cheerful under what he called her disappointments, joined heartily in the laugh, and for a moment they were like two merry children. End of chapter 5. Of A Queen by Ottilie WILDERMUTH. Translated by Unknown. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Esther and Simonides. Chapter 6. The Call of Duty. The countess kept her promise, and the next day, after a long conversation with Colonel Oberstein and his wife, carried Maggie off to her house, where, though she herself took the position of a servant, she was treated in every respect as a daughter. The countess soon became strongly attached to her, and kept her constantly at her side. She herself taught her to write as became a lady, and instructed her in all kinds of plain and fancy needlework, of which she had been before ignorant. The extreme retirement in which the lady lived gave her ample time to devote to her favourite, and well did Maggie improve the advantages thus offered her. Always the same cheerful, industrious little person, always ready and willing to help anybody. Everybody liked her, and seemed ready and willing to help her. She was at liberty to visit the doctor as often as she liked, and her visits made the old man very happy, not only because he loved to have her with him, but because she always carried him books or some other present equally to his taste, which he was too poor to buy for himself. The countess bought from him the whole edition of A Little Manual of Devotions, a book which he had been obliged to publish at his own expense, and which, though full of beautiful prayers and hymns, had sold so slowly that it had almost ruined him, and he feared would soon quite do it. This unexpected bit of good fortune enabled him to hire a little damsel of the neighbourhood to perform for him the little services that had all hitherto been done by Maggie, and so he was more reconciled to her absence. When he saw her so generally beloved and so cheerfully happy in her new home, he fairly sunned himself in her bright eyes, and laughed gaily as he said to himself,
Yes, Our Heavenly Father is wiser than any of us."
And in his heart he thanked him. When Maggie had become skilful in the use of her pen, she wrote several times to her old mistress at the farm, but letter writing was a thing seldom practised there, so she got no answers. She greatly longed, though, to hear once more from the old spot, or to see it. The business that had so providentially brought the countess just then to Dresden was now completed, and she wished to return to the family seat which she had left her son-in-law in possession of. It was a matter of course that Maggie, or as she was now called, Margaret, should go with her, and the girl herself was quite delighted at the idea, for she longed to be again in the country. The preparations for the journey were nearly finished, when one morning Margaret heard her name called from the outside of the house, and saw standing at the gate a young farmer, twirling his hat in his hand. "George!" exclaimed the girl with a cry of delight. "George, is that you? How did you come here?" George was so delighted at seeing her again, and at being so warmly greeted by her, that he at first forgot his errand. It was a sad one. His mother had been for a week dangerously ill, and Lisa was married. Things wouldn't go right, and there was nobody to take care of the sick woman and keep an eye to things about the house.
"Then we thought of you," said George, "and both father and mother were quite satisfied that you should come, and so they told me to greet you heartily from them, and to bid you to come at once as is your duty, and not to desert them in their hour of need. As to the wages," he half whispered, half muttered, "you won't lose by it."
The countess, who had heard of the arrival of Margaret's visitor, now came out and spoke to him very graciously, bidding her take him into the sitting room and treat him with all hospitality and attention. George looked around him at the splendid furniture of her present home, and saw her moving about among it all as though she had been used to it from her babyhood. He looked too at her fine rich clothing, so different from the ragged old farm dress, so soft and delicate in its material, so neat and so becoming in its fit. He saw that, grand as was the lady who owned this fine house, Margaret was to her more as a child than a servant, and, with a heavy heart, gave up all hope that she would listen to his request, and made up his mind to return home without delay. But he knew very little of that kind heart. He knew very little of the high and holy principle by which the orphan girl was guided, that if she felt she ought to obey the precept, "Do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who despitefully use you and persecute you," still more would she feel it to be a duty to do good to those who in her hour of utmost need had given her a home. She went herself to the countess, and told her the business upon which her old friend had come, adding, "His parents took me when I was a poor orphan, and must else have died of want and misery. It is only natural that I should do what I can for them now that they are sick and in trouble. So, if you will permit it, my honoured mistress, I would like to go back with George." "Go, dear child, by all means," said the countess kindly, though it made her sad to think of parting with her even for a little while. "Go, as you say, it is your duty to assist those who did so much for you, but do not stay longer than is absolutely necessary." Many arrangements, however, had to be settled between them before Margaret could go, and the lady determined to postpone her own proposed journey until she could hear from her exactly how long her stay at the farm would be. This settled, Margaret hastily packed a few needed articles in a valise, took leave of the good old doctor and her former mistress, and seated herself in the little cart beside George, who could not find words to express his admiration and gratitude. Poor Margaret, once more the Maggie of old times, could not help weeping for joy as she saw again the familiar objects of her childhood, the well-known fields, the unforgotten house, and the wide green before it, on which stood the lindens, the two dear old lindens. But when she went in and met her old mistress, who presided over all this, when she saw the once strong, active, and healthy woman now lying pale and helpless upon her bed, she sobbed aloud with pity. Everybody was delighted to see Maggie again. "Now Heaven be thanked that you are with us again," sobbed the sick woman. "The blessing of the orphan's God left us when you did, Maggie, for we drove you by our unkindness from our door. Nothing has gone right since."
"Well, it'll all be right now," cried Stephen, as he entered the room. "Now, old wife, lie still on your bed. Things will go right now, and you can afford to be sick."
Maggie was delighted to find that, though she had indeed a great deal to do, health and strength were given her for the purpose. So she set about it right earnestly, and went on with cheerful and undaunted courage. As to homesickness for the city and her pleasant home with the countess, she had no time to indulge in it. She rose early and went to bed late, toiled unceasingly about the house all day, and watched by the bedside of the sick woman nearly all night. The whole place under her care assumed a more tidy and cheerful aspect, and whether busy indoors or without, whenever a stir from the invalid showed that she was awake, her careful nurse was in a moment at her side, with some nourishing dainty or some cooling drink which, amid all her toils, she had found an opportunity to make. Then, when she had given it, she shook up the heated pillow, smoothed the tumbled bed, and left her again to her repose. Everybody seemed the happier for her coming, down to the very housemaids; for many a time, when they were toiling under more than their usual task, Maggie came to their aid, and did no small part of the work herself; and besides, now that she had the management, they had more and very much nicer food at their meals.
"What a way she has!" the stout farmer Stephen often said to himself, when he had been watching how quietly she glided from spot to spot, and accomplished all this. "I never could have believed that she would turn out such a neat, handy little thing."
George was greatly distressed that she had too much to do. He watched her constantly, and whenever he found himself alone with her, would ask anxiously, "Are you not tired, Maggie? Pray go sleep a bit and rest. You'll be ill, surely." But Maggie, with a merry laugh, assured him that she had never felt better in her life. "Indeed," said she, "I think it is much better for me that I have been obliged to go to work again. I fear the lazy life I was leading in the city would have made me ill in the end." The poor sick woman revived beyond all expectation under the gentle and constant care of her young nurse, the only being in the world from whom she would have received it; but her disease was an incurable one, and all Maggie's devotion could not prolong her life. End of chapter 6. Recording by Esther Simonides. A Queen by Ottilie WILDERMUTH. Translated by Unknown. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Esther Simonides. Chapter 7. Maggie's Choice. The mother was dead, and grief spread a solemn silence over the whole family. Daily duties that could not be omitted were performed more quickly and quietly than usual, and everybody moved and spoke softly. On Sunday they laid her to her rest, and said an earnest prayer over her simple grave, that the blessed Father in heaven would let them all meet once more in that more beautiful and better world, and then they went to their home. Even on Monday none of them felt like work, and the farmer, with his children and Maggie, sat together in the afternoon in the little garden, and talked to the departed of her industry and carefulness in her days of health, of her patience and suffering in her days of sickness, and of their trust that she was now in the enjoyment of rest. Suddenly one of the housemaids rushed breathless to where they were sitting, exclaiming, "A coach, a most elegant coach, and just here at the door!" They all left the garden and moved towards the gate, where they saw, sure enough, an elegant coach, drawn by two fine, sleek-looking horses, striving to make its way over the rough roads and drive up to the door of the farmhouse. Presently the lady that was within ordered the liveried coachman to stop, saying that she would alight and walk up to the door. It was the countess. In the great confusion into which the death of the mother had thrown everything, Maggie had allowed the last week to pass without writing to her, and she, anxious to leave the city, and thinking it impossible to go without her favourite, had determined to go herself to the farm, and learn if anything had befallen her, or, if possible, to take her back with her. When she learned the death of the good woman, she spoke very kindly and feelingly to the farmer and his family, trying to show them how mercifully the good God had dealt in sparing her to them so long, and in taking her now from her sufferings. At the same time she expressed the hope that now all was over, Margaret might no longer be needed, and might go with her to her home again. The farmer, after many efforts, at last found courage to address the lady.
"You see, your Excellency," said he, with a great deal of embarrassment, "this lad, my son George here, has been deeply in love with the girl this long time, long before you knew her, your Excellency, and, I must say it, his mother and I both so stupid as not to see how we were standing in our own light. We both felt a bit puffed up with the blessings that God had poured out on us, and thought our boy too good for a poor destitute orphan that had nothing but a kind heart and a pair of nimble, skilful hands for her bridal portion, so we wouldn't let it be. But here, upon her deathbed, George told his mother how much he wanted her for a wife, and she had got to know her better, you see, and so, though she was too far gone to speak it, she gave a silent blessing on it, and, if I must say it, well she might, she'd have been a most heartless, ungrateful woman to have held out against it after all that Maggie had done for her and hers. Yes, your Excellency, she learned to know before she went that the very blessing that made us so proud was just all along of what we did for Maggie when her own poor mother died. Anyhow, the mother's consent made us both very happy, and my son George and me. It just seemed to me the thing that ought to be, and so if they do be married, I would just give up the farm to them, you see, your Excellency, and just set down myself to rest, for I need it. I've worked hard in my day." "Is Margaret willing, then, to marry your son?" asked the countess. "You see, your excellency, we have not had the courage to ask her just yet," replied the farmer. "Oh, well then," said the lady with a smile, "I shall have to do it for you, I see. Tell me freely, my dear child, whether you will stay here or return with me. You know that I love you as tenderly as though I were really your mother, and I promise you, if you do stay with me, not only to take care of you while I live, but to make an ample provision for you in case anything should happen to me." George said not a word, for he remembered all the splendour of the countess's home. He looked sadly at Margaret and said nothing, but she did not keep him long in suspense. "Dear lady," said she with moistened eyes, "God will surely bless you for all the kindness you have shown me. I love you as dearly as I could love the best mother, but do not take it amiss if I stay with George. I have loved him as long and as well as he has loved me; and besides, I must not forget that his home is a more fitting home for me than yours is. I believe you have chosen aright, my dear noble-hearted child, and not for one moment would I set my feelings in comparison with your happiness and interests. But be assured I shall not forget to care properly for my adopted daughter. You shall not go empty-handed into your husband's house." George's brothers and sisters, who had heard all that passed, were not slow in spreading it abroad, and there was rejoicing over the whole farm. George himself was so extravagantly happy that he was on the point of expressing it in his usual boisterous way, by leaping up and shouting "Hurrah!" when he recollected, just in time to save his good name, that he was in deep mourning, and that there was sorrow as well as gladness in the house. Besides, upon reflection, he concluded that turning somersets was not altogether a becoming occupation for a man who was about to be married. End of chapter 7. Recording by Esther and Simonides. Chapter 8 of A Queen by Ottilie WILDERMUTH. Translated by Unknown. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Esther and Simonides. Chapter 8 A Home Queen. Many years have passed since the little maiden of our first acquaintance drove her flock of sheep into the farmyard. The farmer's house stands there still, and every chair and stool occupy the same place within it that they did in the days of poor old Granny. Maggie, too, is there, but no longer is the orphan dependent upon charity for a home. She is now the mistress of the farm, the house-mother. Gertrude has grown to be a great girl, and hangs with affection about her sister-in-law. One of George's brothers is in America, the other still works upon the farm, and will pass the rest of his life there. The old farmer, Father Stephen of the Tannenhof, as he is called among the neighbours, is still well and tolerably strong for a man of his age. Indeed, he says that he ought to live twice as long as other people, to enjoy seeing the industry and good management of his daughter-in-law, and the honour in which she is everywhere held. He still works a little with the others, but not much. But his great enjoyment is to go, in the warm sunny afternoon, to walk over the broad fields, and see what rich blessings the Father in heaven sends, even in the times men call the worst, upon those who strive to serve and obey him. None could persuade Stephen that he would thus have prospered in his fields and his home, had he turned the poor spinning woman's orphan from his door, and left her to be cared for by strangers. None will ever make him doubt the truth of God's promise. He who giveth to one of these little ones a cup of cold water shall by no means lose his reward. He thinks that he has been repaid richly, principal and interest, for every penny little Maggie ever cost him. And so he has, in more ways than one. The rich wedding gift of the countess, added to the care and industry of the master, has made the farm indeed a noble one, and much has the young mother done for that master. Guided by her gentle precepts and example, he rules in joy and friendship all who surround him in the house and in the fields, and above all, in godly fear, he seeks to do not only what seems best for the worldly interests of his family, but what is right in the sight of God, and will bring down his blessing upon his toil. And amid all the prosperity that is thus bestowed upon her, amid all the abundance with which she is surrounded, Maggie has never forgotten that once she lived in this very house, a poor, destitute orphan, thrown by God's providence upon the charity of those whose place she now fills. The orphan never goes unrelieved from her door, and when the harvest is gathered in, bountifully is the table spread at the Tannenhof, not only for the reapers who have gathered it, but for the poor gleaners too, live they far or near.
Nor is that all, for what is left from the meal never comes again upon her table. They glean the fragments thereto, and carry them home in their baskets, and not for all the joys and blessings that have been showered upon her does grateful Maggie ever give such earnest, heartfelt thanks to her Father on high, as for what she has the power to bestow upon the poor and friendless. That she once lived at service in the city with great people, least of all that she was, yes, and still is, the dear adopted child of a countess, none would ever find out from her style of dress, any more than they would from her behaviour or manners, though some might fancy that they could see its influence in the neatness and cleanliness with which she dresses her children and keeps her house, or in the winning softness of her voice and manners. When Maggie had been nearly 10 years, and had become sole mistress of the farm, with her husband's consent she had the large upper room in which poor Granny had died nicely cleaned and fitted up like a town lodging, and then George went himself to see for and bring the poor old doctor to take possession of it, that he might end his days with them, free from care. But alas, he was too late. The doctor was dead. They had found him one morning lifeless in his bed. But he had not forgotten Maggie, and in his will had left her a fine and well-selected portion of his books. To herself it was almost a valueless gift, for she had little leisure and still less inclination for reading. But for her children it proved, in after years, a valuable inheritance. Though the old man never occupied the room so nicely prepared, Maggie soon after had the delight of receiving a visit from the countess, accompanied by 2 of her young granddaughters, who all came to pass a week with her. Indeed, they would have stayed longer, but the little ladies ate so much bread and fresh butter, and drank so much rich sweet cream, that they both became ill. Before the countess left, however, she made arrangements for erecting a neat gravestone to the memory of poor Christine, the spinning woman, as she was called throughout the neighbourhood, but to her the faithful servant and valued friend. It is again a beautiful Sunday evening, and the family, as at the beginning of our story, are enjoying their pleasant evening rest upon the lawn. George and Maggie stooping a little, the old grandfather in his great leathern chair that has been placed in the sun, and 2 rosy-cheeked boys and a strong healthy girl are wandering about, as George and his brother and sister are used to do formerly. But instead of the orphan Maggie, there sat our eldest son, reading from the Bible the story of Joseph and his brethren. So clear were his tones and so earnest his manner, that the old grandfather declared he must be a clergyman. In Joseph's dream Maggie saw the counterpart of her own, and nodding and laughing to her husband said, "Didn't my dream come out too? I was to be a queen, you know." George looked round at his bright, healthy children, and abroad upon his broad, rich fields. He thought too of the peace in his home, and then looked at his faithful wife. And when he had done all this, he felt very much like making some kind of a speech. But all his life long he had never been a speech-maker. Yet his heart was so full that he must say something. So he took the Bible from the boy's hand, and only observed, "Give it to me, and I will read something too." It did not take him long to find what he sought, for he was well read in the Holy Book, and soon he began to read. "Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favour is deceitful, and beauty is vain. But a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised." The tears rose to Maggie's eyes, and she bent her head forward like a queen upon whose brow they were about to place a crown. But it was already there. The love of her husband and household was the crown of her rejoicing. The End. End of chapter 8. Recording by Esther and Simonides. End of A Queen by Ottilie WILDERMUTH. Translated by Unknown.